It's just paperwork, Caleb. Cleaning up an old mistake from the 60s so the county's GIS map finally matches reality. Your grandfather already signed off on it. I don't know why you're making this complicated. My uncle said that, standing at the tailgate of his truck at the edge of the orchard, arms crossed, like a man who'd rehearsed the sentence in his head a few times before he said it out loud. Behind him, staked into the dirt where the old fence line used to run, sat a brand new survey flag, bright pink, 40 feet deeper into my grandfather's protected orchard rows than any line had ever run in the 64 years I knew that property had existed. I've walked that boundary with a compass and a chain more times than I can count. First as a kid trailing behind my grandfather on summer mornings, later as a licensed surveyor doing it the way the state actually requires it to be done. I know exactly where those lines sit because my grandfather taught me, before I could even read a plat map, that a boundary isn't a suggestion. It's a fact somebody already established, and your only job is to go find the evidence of it, not invent a more convenient version. I didn't say much to my uncle that afternoon. I took a GPS reading off that new pink flag, wrote the coordinates in my field book, and drove straight to the county recorder's office. 6 weeks later, in front of the Talbot County Land Use Board, in a room packed with everyone who'd ever bought an apple from that orchard's roadside stand, I would stand up during public comment holding a folder of survey evidence that would end my uncle's development deal, his landscaping business's last chance at solvency, and a story he'd spent nearly a year building about an old surveying mistake that, it turned out, had never actually existed. My name is Caleb Dunmore. I'm 28 years old, and I'm a licensed land surveyor, which means I've spent my career learning that the truth about where a property line actually sits is never really up for debate. It's just a matter of who bothers to go find the evidence, and who hopes nobody ever will. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who stays until a story's finished, subscribe now, because it's going to take me the next half hour to tell you exactly how my uncle tried to move a boundary line that had been fixed since 1961, and exactly how badly that went for him to understand what happened in that hearing room. You need to understand an orchard that's grown apples on the same 105 acres since 1961, a boundary line my great-grandfather had surveyed and staked the year he bought, the land, and a family that had quietly stopped agreeing, long before I was old enough to notice, about what that land was actually worth. Orchard Bend sits in a river valley about 40 minutes from the nearest city, the kind of place where half the county still drives out every October for the cider stand my grandfather set up at the same spot on Route 9 since before my mother was born. My grandfather, Frank Dunmore, took over the orchard from his own father in 1979 and ran it for nearly 5 decades, planting new rows of Honeycrisp and Gala alongside the older winesap trees his father had put in the ground. And in 2005, at an age when most people are simplifying rather than complicating their affairs, he put 90 of the orchard's 105 acres under a permanent agricultural conservation easement with the County Land Trust, a legal commitment that the working orchard could never be subdivided or developed, in exchange for a modest tax benefit and, more than that, my grandfather's own quiet insistence that the land outlive whatever any one generation eventually decided to do with the rest of their lives. The remaining 15 acres, a flat, unplanted parcel fronting Route 9, separate from the easement, had always been understood, informally, as the piece that would eventually come to me. I was the only one of my grandfather's grandchildren who'd ever wanted anything to do with land the way he understood it. I spent every summer from age 9 to 18 walking those orchard rows beside him, and somewhere around 12, he started teaching me to find the original iron survey pins his father had set when the county surveyed the property in 1961. A strange, patient ritual for a kid that age, kneeling in the dirt with a metal detector and a hand level, but one that put me on a path toward a surveying license by the time I was 24. My grandmother, Marion, passed in 2019. My grandfather kept running the orchard largely on his own after that, though cataract surgery 2 years ago left him with permanently reduced close-up vision. Fine for walking his own rows from memory, considerably harder for reading small print on a legal document without someone reading it to him first. He had 2 children, my mother, Paula, who married young and moved 40 minutes away, and my uncle Dale, who stayed local and built a landscaping and hardscaping business, Dunmore Landscape and Design, that had done reasonably well for about 15 years before residential construction in the county slowed sharply and left him carrying far more equipment debt than the business could currently support. I want to be clear, I never disliked my uncle growing up. He taught me to drive a stick shift in an empty parking lot when I was 15. This isn't his villain origin story, not entirely. But you need to understand the shape of his debt before I show you what he tried to do about it, Tai-Bai. The spring of last year, according to records I'd only pieced together much later, Dunmore Landscape and Design owed roughly $180,000 across 2 equipment loans and a supplier line of credit, with the primary lender signaling it would call the debt due in full if a substantial payment didn't land within the year. Around that same time, a regional developer called Ridgeline Development Partners had started quietly assembling parcels along the Route 9 corridor for a planned housing development, and a Ridgeline representative named Craig Sorensen had reached out to my uncle directly, having apparently done enough homework to know exactly which 15-acre unrestricted parcel sat conveniently adjacent to 90 acres of otherwise undevelopable land. 15 acres alone, fronting a state highway, was worth a reasonable sum on its own. 15 acres combined with an additional 6 or 7 acres carved out of the protected orchard, enough to square off the parcel into something considerably more attractive for a subdivision layout, was worth close to 3 times as much, according to the numbers Dana Pruitt, our family's longtime real estate attorney, would later help me understand. There was, of course, one significant problem standing between my uncle and that larger number. A permanent conservation easement doesn't simply move because somebody wants it to. What it can do, at least on paper, is get corrected. If a landowner and a licensed surveyor can convincingly claim that the original 1961 survey contained an error and that the true, more accurate boundary always sat somewhere slightly different than everyone had assumed for 64 years. My uncle found his surveyor in a man named Marv Petrosky, a semi-retired land surveyor 2 counties over with a pending complaint before the State Board of Registration for Professional Land Surveyors. A complaint, I'd learn much later, involving a separate boundary dispute where Marv had signed off on a corrected retracement survey without properly documenting the original monument evidence the way state minimum standards actually require. He needed the work. My uncle needed a stamp. In April, Marv filed a new survey with the county recorder's office describing a boundary between the easement-protected orchard and the unrestricted 15 acres that ran, at several points, nearly 40 feet deeper into the orchard than the original 1961 line. To make that survey stick, my uncle needed one more thing: my grandfather's signature on a boundary line, adjustment consent form, the kind of document that, properly explained, should have taken a licensed attorney and a considerable conversation to walk through. What it actually took, according to what my grandfather would later tell me, was about 10 minutes at his kitchen table, my uncle describing it as just cleaning up some old GIS mismatch from the 60s, nothing that actually changes the fence line. And my grandfather, whose eyes could no longer comfortably read the small print of a legal description without a magnifier, he didn't have handy that afternoon, taking his son's word for it and signing where he was shown. I found out about all of this the way I find out about most things in this family, sideways, weeks after the fact, in a conversation that wasn't really about the thing itself. I'd stopped by the orchard on a Sunday in early May, mostly just to help my grandfather clear some brush along the tree line, and he mentioned it almost as an afterthought, wiping his hands on his jeans between rows. Dale had somebody come out and fix some old survey mistake a few weeks back, he said. Says the original 61 survey had the line off by a bit, and the county's paperwork's finally getting corrected to match. Didn't seem worth making a fuss over. I stopped clearing brush. What surveyor did the correction? Some fellow Dale found. Petrosky, I think? I'd never heard the name, which in a county this size, working the boundary line business I work, struck me as immediately strange. I asked my grandfather if he still had a copy of what he'd signed. He didn't. Dale had told him the county would mail him a copy once it was formally recorded, and he hadn't thought to ask for one himself in the meantime. I want to be honest about something. I didn't drive straight to the recorder's office that same afternoon in a fit of suspicion. I told myself, initially, that surveys do get legitimately corrected sometimes. Old monuments get lost. Original math from 6 decades ago occasionally does contain small errors. And it wasn't impossible that this was exactly the routine cleanup my uncle described. What actually got me moving was a smaller, more specific detail. The original 1961 survey had been done by the county itself, using monuments my own great-grandfather had personally set, and my own grandfather had shown me, one by one, when I was a kid. I knew, with a level of certainty most people never get to have about anything, exactly where those pins sat. If the new survey moved the line, it wasn't correcting an old mistake. It was either finding evidence nobody had ever found before, or it wasn't based on evidence at all. I drove to the county recorder's office the following Monday on my lunch break and pulled the newly filed survey. If you've ever had a small, offhand comment from someone you love suddenly not sit right with you for reasons you couldn't immediately name, tell me in the comments, because that conversation in the orchard was the moment I stopped assuming this was nothing. Marv Petrosky's new survey, on its face, looked professional enough. Proper county formatting, a licensed surveyor's stamp, a legal description that read cleanly. What it didn't include, and what any properly conducted retracement survey is required by state minimum standards to include, was any documented evidence of the original 1961 monuments at all. No field notes describing pins found or not found. No explanation for why the new line diverged from 6 decades of recorded deeds, tax maps, and the county's own GIS parcel data, all of which had used the same boundary, without dispute, since before my grandfather ever took over the orchard. That Saturday, I drove out to the property with my own equipment, a sub-meter GPS unit, a metal detector, and the original 1961 county plat, which I'd pulled and printed at the recorder's office. I knew roughly where to start looking, because I'd stood at those exact points as a kid, watching my grandfather's boots settle into the same worn patches of grass year after year. It took me about 90 minutes to find the first one, a capped iron pin, exactly where the 1961 plat said it should be. Exactly where I remembered kneeling beside my grandfather at age 12. I found the second one 40 minutes after that, buried under a decade of leaf litter, but entirely intact. Both pins sat precisely on the original boundary line. Neither one sat anywhere near the new line Marv Petrosky had drawn. I photographed both monuments, logged their coordinates, and compared them against Petrosky's filed survey. The discrepancy at the first pin was 38 feet. At the second, 41 feet. There was no ambiguity left to argue about. The new survey hadn't corrected an old error. It had simply ignored physical evidence that had been sitting in the ground, undisturbed, for 64 years, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting the original line, and the easement boundary along with it had never actually moved at all. I called Ellen Choi, the county's deputy surveyor, the following Monday, and drove her out to both monuments myself. She confirmed what I already knew within the first few minutes of standing over the second pin. State minimum standards require a retracement survey to give priority to found original monuments over any recalculated distance, she told me, crouched beside the pin with her own equipment. This survey doesn't even mention that these exist. I don't know how Mr. Petrosky is planning to explain that to the board, but I can already tell you it isn't going to be a satisfying explanation. She flagged the filing for review that same week and, separately, forwarded her findings to the State Board of Registration, noting Petrosky's existing pending complaint in her cover letter. I brought everything to Dana Pruitt, our family's attorney, the following week. The original plat, my monument photographs and coordinates, Ellen's letter, and Petrosky's filed survey laid out side by side. This alone is enough to get the corrected survey thrown out at the county level, Dana told me. What I want to understand is why your uncle needed it thrown in the first place, because a boundary correction this aggressive on protected land usually isn't about tidiness. It's about making a deal work that wouldn't work otherwise. It didn't take her long to find it. A public notice had gone up 2 weeks earlier for an upcoming Talbot County Land Use Board hearing, a concept plan review for a 21-lot residential development called Ridgeline at Orchard Bend, submitted by Ridgeline Development Partners, covering a combined parcel that included both my grandfather's 15 unrestricted acres and roughly 6 additional acres carved from the orchard's easement land, using as its supporting boundary documentation Marv Petrosky's newly filed survey. Dana pulled the option agreement itself through a records request tied to the public hearing filing. My uncle had signed an option to sell both parcels to Ridgeline for $890,000. Contingent explicitly on the corrected survey being accepted and the Land Use Board approving the concept plan, a deal that, once closed, would have cleared his entire debt with room to spare, and would have permanently carved developable acreage out of land my grandfather had spent 2 decades protecting. Your grandfather signed a boundary adjustment form believing he was correcting a paperwork mismatch, Dana said. What he actually signed authorized giving away 6 acres of permanently protected orchard, based on a survey that doesn't meet the state's own minimum standards for evidence. I don't think that holds up for 1 minute once a board actually looks at it closely. But I want us to be the ones making sure they look closely, not hoping they get there on their own. I want to pause here because I don't think this story is honest if I let you believe my cousin Tyler simply stood behind his father without a thought of his own in any of it. Tyler works alongside my uncle at the landscaping business, and it was Tyler, it turned out, who'd actually driven my grandfather to the notary's office the day he signed the boundary consent form, and Tyler, who'd scheduled Marv Petrosky's site visit in the first place, at his father's request, without asking many questions about why it needed to happen so quickly or why it couldn't wait for Dana Pruitt to review it first. I drove out to see him at the equipment yard 2 weeks before the hearing and told him plainly what I'd found. He was quiet for a long moment, turning a socket wrench over in his hands. "Dad told me it was routine," he said finally. Said Grandpa already understood what he was signing. I didn't think I had any reason to check that myself. He set the wrench down. I drove Grandpa to that notary's office myself, Caleb. I sat in the waiting room while he signed something I didn't fully understand either, and I didn't ask a single hard question the whole time because it was easier not to. 3 days later, without my asking him to, Tyler gave Dana a written statement describing the timeline of that notary visit exactly as he remembered it. It didn't undo what his father had set in motion, but it was, I think, the first fully honest thing he'd done in this whole arrangement, and I've never regretted telling him before the hearing instead of letting him find out with everyone else in that room. The hearing was held in the county administration building, a room I'd sat in a handful of times professionally, but never quite like this. My grandfather came, sitting beside my mother in the third row, and my uncle presented the Ridgeline concept plan from the podium with the same easy, practiced confidence he'd used to sell hardscaping packages for 15 years. 21 lots, walkable streets, a natural extension of a beloved local landmark, gesturing at a rendering that included, unmistakably, 6 acres of orchard that had never legally been his to offer. When the board opened public comment, I stood, gave my name and my surveying license number for the record, and laid out what I'd found. The original 1961 monuments, the coordinates, the 40-foot discrepancy. Ellen Choi's letter confirming the corrected survey failed to meet state minimum retracement standards, and the pending Board of Registration complaint against the surveyor who'd signed it. Chairwoman Patricia Ames asked Craig Sorensen, Ridgeline's representative, whether the company had independently verified the boundary survey before entering into the option agreement. He admitted, after a pause that told the room everything it needed to know, that they'd relied entirely on the survey my uncle's team had provided. My uncle didn't get up to argue any of it. I watched him sit very still at the applicant's table while Dana entered Ellen's letter and my monument photographs into the record. His face doing something I'd genuinely never seen it do in 28 years. It simply stopped performing, all at once, with nothing left to arrange itself into. The board tabled the application indefinitely, pending resolution of the boundary dispute and the state's review of Petrosky's license, and Chairwoman Ames noted for the record that any future application relying on that survey would need to be resubmitted with proper monument documentation, assuming one can actually be produced. The corrected survey was formally voided by the county recorder within a month, and the original 1961 boundary, the one my great-grandfather set, the one my grandfather taught me to find by hand, was restored on every county record without dispute. Marv Petrosky's license was suspended pending the Board of Registration's review, and the option agreement with Ridgeline dissolved on its own once the board tabled the application. My uncle's landscaping business filed for reorganization 2 months later. I don't know yet whether it survives. Tyler still works construction, though not for his father anymore. We talk most weeks now. My grandfather and I still walk the orchard rows most Sundays, same as always. And a few weeks after the hearing, without either of us saying much about it, he handed me a small tin box he'd kept in his workshop for years, a spare set of monument caps and a hand level that had belonged to his own father. Your great-grandfather always said a line's only as good as the last person who bothered to go find it, he told me. Seems like that's still you. If you've ever been the one person in your family who actually went and checked instead of just taking someone's word for it, tell me in the comments what that cost you and whether it was worth it. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right moment tonight, share it with the person in your life who's still doing the checking. They'll know exactly why.